Well, great. Very excited to be here today with two of our partners, Mike Volpe and Sarah Cannon, to have an open discussion on all things related to AI, both as it pertains to 2021 and the future. So first off, an introduction of both Mike and Sarah. Mike is a partner here at Index. He's been here for many, many years and has spent a lot of his time investing in artificial intelligence companies, including companies such as Covariant, Scale, Abacus, Aurora, Arthur AI, amongst many other unannounced investments. And Sarah likewise has spent a good chunk of her time investing in artificial intelligence companies, most notably in Grid AI, where I have the pleasure of working with her, as well as in Instabase. And I myself am Brian Offit. I'm a principal here at Index Ventures, who also spends a good amount of time poking around at assorted artificial intelligence companies. So I think to kick things off, one of the things that's really fantastic about artificial intelligence as a category is that it spans many levels of abstraction. It's fascinating technically. There's a lot of complex math going on. It's fascinating from an engineering perspective in terms of how you frame the problem and develop a system that you can eventually deploy into a production environment. And it's fascinating philosophically. There are, very important ethical concerns with regards to how the technology is applied. And in the super meta case, even implications that drive us to think about what it means to be a person, what it means to be human. And amongst all, it's one of the fastest growing categories and areas of technology that we've seen in quite a long time. Kind of starting with 2012, when you had ImageNet kind of catapulting deep learning to the forefront. In 2017, you have the Google Attention is All You Need paper, which brings transformers into the equation, particularly for NLP. And as a result of both of those things, the progress over the past decade has been truly, truly amazing. And so to kind of play on that, to kick things off, I'd love to ask Mike first, given how quickly AI is evolving and has evolved over the past decade, what do you imagine the largest developments will be in the kind of next 3 to 5 year time frame?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's pretty extraordinary because, AI is essentially that. It's trying to mimic human beings. And if you think about all the amazing things that we do as human beings, and that gradually that AI is going to do some of those on our behalf, it's pretty amazing. There are some things that everybody talks about all the time. Like I do think a substantial number of cars will be driving that use AI. And I think there's going to be lots of interesting robots that are out there that do the kind of work that historically humans have done somewhat begrudgingly. But I also think the less talked about stuff is how much of the sort of intellectual work that we do today might be actually done by AI. And so I'm going to guess that over the next 3 to 5 years, well, I'm going to actually take this back a little bit. When, I'm old enough that when I had to take math tests, there was a question as to whether we could bring calculators into the test room or whether we had to do everything by hand. And calculators were considered cheating. And I think that there's going to be some interesting stuff with AI where there's going to be a lot of students that use AI technology to do things for them. For example, AI technology might be able to actually write an essay on your behalf. And I think you're going to see a lot of that. And we're going to have to figure out what is actually cheating versus what is the real work. But it's inevitable that AI is going to write and communicate on our behalf. And so I think we're going to see a lot of interesting applications where the end output to all of us humans is text or audio in some cases. But the producer of that might no longer be a human being, and it might very well be an instance of AI.
Yeah, they used to tell us that you wouldn't always have a calculator in your pocket was the justification for not bringing them to tests. And it turns out that was most certainly wrong, given we all have that and more. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next few years. Sarah, I would ask you the same question. Kind of how are you thinking about the next 3 to 5 years as it pertains to changes in AI and what that means for society more broadly as our resident economist.
Yeah, well, you opened Pandora's box here. I think the first thing that comes to mind is the impact on video. Like, given what 2020 was as a year, we just have a lot more video data to input into a lot of different algorithms. So I think that will be a very interesting development to watch in the next year and beyond. Like, as you know, traditionally, we've been looking at text as inputs or even images, but now we have a lot of video. So I think that's going to be a really interesting development and potentially a way that, you know, the pandemic and in 2020 and our use of Zoom will accelerate some of these advancements. So that's one. A second that I'm particularly interested in that I hope we dig into is on the policy side. I mean, we have a new administration that is starting in January of next year. And I think they might have a different approach to regulating AI or developing even potentially a national strategy around it. So that's something that I'm particularly attuned to. And then the third area that's quite interesting to me is art and how AI, you know, you talked about, Brian, you started with all the levels of abstraction. And one, obviously, on the artistic field has been, you know, will algorithms be creating music for us or operas or films? And we can debate how good they are at doing that. But those are three things I'm watching.
Yeah, you know, it's really interesting. You both touched on something through different angles that I think is a good follow-up here. You know, Mike, you talked about, you know, models have changed from being largely predictive to largely generative, and you got at this through the context of cheating college students. Sarah, you got at the same thing with regards to art, right? And this is one of the major changes that we've seen in artificial intelligence over the past couple of years. And I think the thing that really hurled this into the public consciousness, certainly the tech public consciousness, has been GPT-3, right? It's kind of the culmination of a lot of research that's been happening over the past couple of years in natural language processing, resulting in this model that you can ask it to generate net new things that are, you know, depending on the context, pretty difficult to tell from something that's been created by a person. So just to kind of keep the order consistent, Mike, I'd love to hear how you are thinking about that beyond the context of, you know, what it means for education and what it might mean for businesses in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting, right? Because you know, if you sort of zoom out a little bit, how do these machines, this artificial intelligence, learn to do generative work that, you know, you were talking about, right? Which is that it essentially reads a lot of documents, just like we do. We read a lot of documents, and we assemble sort of reason and deduction and extraction from that reading. Which then, when asked to generate, we sort of fiddle with that in our head, and we come up with something that's, quote, new. The interesting concept, I think, is what is genuinely creative that just humans do. Forget machines, but what is genuinely creative about what we do versus it's the reassembly of knowledge that we've accumulated from other sources. And I think that, you know, because creativity is such a deeply human thing, we think of ourselves as being very, very creative. That's the difference between us and a lot of other things that populate the world, is that we're creative. The truth is, we're probably not quite as creative as we think we are. You know, oftentimes if you read a book about leadership and then you practice that, it's not actually creative. You're just simply reusing somebody else's content. I think what we'll discover is we're probably a little less creative than we think we are, and that over the long term, and this is probably beyond the 3 to 5 years, Brian, that you were talking about, but over like a decade-long period, we will have a harder and harder time distinguishing between what is human creativity versus, quote, creativity generated by artificial intelligence. And I think for the large majority of human beings, we're going to have a harder and harder time distinguishing between computer created creativity or computer generated creativity and human generated creativity. And, you know, that'll be interesting. And whether that's good or bad, who knows? But I think the process fundamentally that is being conducted by machines versus humans is actually quite similar. It just that happens that we do it organically with neurons and machines do it electronically with bits and bytes.
And Sarah, I would ask you, you know, the same thing, particularly as someone who is a big fan and aficionado of art. How do you think about what this means for creativity and what our relationship in general will be with kind of machines over the next couple of years and then in the long run.
Yeah, well, Mike started with, the value of creativity. I mean, the way I think of what machines can't do that humans do, maybe it's a definition of creativity, is asking net new questions. So there's one, leveraging existing information to come up with something new. But then there is also asking the philosophical question of like, what does it mean to be human? Like that might not come out of a series of historical philosophers, but what does it mean to be human versus robot? So the ability to ask questions is what I think of as still fundamentally human. And as far as I know, GPT-3 can't do that. So that's how I think I'm still long humans. So that's first. Second, GPT-3 sparked a lot of ideas for me too, just in the rate of its kind of development. And one question, I hope I'll say this and then some entrepreneur will hear it and actually do it, or researcher, I wonder if there's a Moore's law for the rate of AI development. We've had this in compute, and I wonder if there is some predictable rate, accelerating rate at which we get kind of breakthroughs in AI, and maybe that is by subfield. But that's something that GPT-3 made me think about. And the third is like, what do products look like with GPT-3 in mind? So I'll say like some of the companies that we work with, we'll say like, oh my gosh, there's now this new technology on offer. How do I include that into my product? So if it's a messaging product, it's, oh, well, could I leverage this technology to have an abstract that comes out of the conversation that the three of us are having? But how are you going to build products differently when you know that this kind of technology is available? Mm-hmm. So I think that will be quite an interesting thing to watch in the coming years when entrepreneurs are aware of the kind of technology that they can leverage from OpenAI to do things differently in their own businesses.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I think when I think about creativity, it's interesting to observe that most people that are viewed as being truly great creatives don't tend to come from very cookie cutter backgrounds, right? And so, in large part, it does feel like creativity is the combination of disparate experiences in a unique way, where many people haven't been able to tie this thing and this thing and this thing together into something that's cohesive, right? And this is the argument for diversity as a general term: diversity of experience, diversity within your team, whatever diversity kind of dot star. And that's something I think we could probably learn when we develop these algorithms, right? Is how can we bring a diverse perspective of data into the algorithm the same way that we try to bring a diverse perspective of life experience as a person that helps us make better decisions, whether as an individual, as a group, which kind of is a nice transition, right? One of the things that we as people are unfortunately kind of plagued by is bias, right? We all have our own biases that sort of span a variety of different topics and areas that are, I believe, usually informed by your life experience. And similarly with machine learning models, bias is a huge problem, right? It's not just a function of the data, right, which can be part of it. It's the process of developing an objective function. It's the problem you're applying it to. There are many, many ways in which bias can inject itself into the process of developing and deploying machine learning models. And I think this is going to be something that's a huge topic of conversation in the coming years. So I'd love to hear, Mike, how are you thinking about bias in the context of machine learning? Obviously, you're involved with Index's investment in Arthur. And so we'd love to hear your thoughts on how this will play out in the next couple of years.
Yeah, a few thoughts around this, because it's a super interesting subject, right? So the word bias, when used in the English language, generally has a negative connotation to it. And I think we just have to step back 1 second, which is bias is just a shortcut that humans use, right? We're too lazy to think through something. And so we create a shortcut that says, black is good, white is bad. That's a bias. And that is useful, generally speaking, for certain functions that we perform in life. Now, that usefulness, when applied in the wrong context, can have very negative consequences. And that's when bias turns negative. I think it's, first of all, important to understand that shortcuts are a useful thing largely for human beings. And the fact that, we have the ability to do them isn't necessarily all negative. Now, bias can come about from two reasons. One is that all the data that you have looked at points to a certain direction, and you have never seen data outside of that context. And therefore, you make a shortcut decision based on a finite set of data that turns out to not be representative of the whole world. no matter how good the machine learning algorithm is, like I don't care how good your AI is, if you have bad biased data, you're going to get bad biased outcomes. AI system is not able to interpret data that it doesn't see. Just like a human being has a very hard of it. The nice thing about humans is that we can be told data that we don't necessarily see and interpret that and weave it into us. Machines have a little bit of a harder time right now, but the first and big problem is let's fix the data. Data is hard to fix in our world, and it's super hard to fix because biases permeate human life. They're everywhere in what we do. And so if we want machines to be unbiased, we have to start by unbiasing ourselves. And unbiasing ourselves is a taxing thing because every human is biased in their own way and has shortcuts of all kinds. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that where machines encounter bias is where the algorithm is supposed to be spitting out a certain result, and for some reason, it starts spitting out a wrong set of results. That's slightly more particular to machine learning algorithms and how they work. And there you can introduce a lot of good tools, systems essentially, that safeguard against that. The technical term that's often used is called drift. Models drift in AI. And so figuring out how to address that model drift, first of all, recognize it, understand why it's happening, and then fix it and correct it. That's a very approachable problem, which I think within the next 2 or 3 years will be very standard issue for most machine learning systems. And I think we'll have that problem not totally eliminated, but certainly contained within reasonable boundaries.
Yeah, and it's interesting, a lot of the, talk about GPT-3, there's a huge section of the paper, and hopefully this becomes a broader trend in the industry, addressing the biases in the data set and what they expect the bias of the algorithm to be, amongst other things that are really great, such as, the energy consumption and things along those lines. And so hopefully, this focus on this issue will become something that's a focus for the entire life cycle, from research to application of the model in production. Sarah, I know we've talked extensively about the implications ethically of machine learning on society. And in fact, we almost missed a flight once having this very conversation. So I'd love to get the abridged version of some of the things we talked about and how you think about the ethical implications of artificial intelligence on society more broadly.
Yeah, well, I think the most near term, I'll start with your hierarchy of near term employment implications and move on from that. I think the obvious, and Mike alluded to this earlier, is everyone says, will our jobs be replaced? I don't think it's that simple of a question. I think it's fractions of our jobs. Well, some people's jobs, to be clear, will be replaced. And I think that will have a societal impact in the near term. And one that, in my view, our current policy infrastructure is not well set up to address. Second, I think there are some fractions of everybody's jobs that will be impacted by artificial intelligence, and then there will be some set of net new jobs. So some people who are impacted dramatically, some, in some fraction, and some, who will benefit greatly by the new opportunities that are created. So I think, you mentioned my background is in economics. That's the most significant impact on the broadest set of people in your kind of daily ability to earn wages from your labor. So I'd say that is incredibly important. I'd say at a policy level, another thing that is quite, I think, interesting is, are there rules around needing to enforce synthetic data sets? So Mike talked a lot about, naturally the historical data sets that we have are potentially concentrated on certain populations or certain countries, for example. And do you require, or do companies do this, where you're introducing synthetic data to feed into the algorithm to correct for the existing historical bias? So I think that's potentially another, major societal impact. And I think thirdly, there's an interesting geopolitical question, which is, if countries have different approaches to how they manage the aggregation of data, how does that play out on a geopolitical stage? I won't go too far down that path, but China obviously has kind of a different approach. And even if you look at the technology platforms like WeChat, for example, who has multiple products and a lot of data, that provides an advantage. Like more data equals better predictive results in AI. So that can create some winner take most dynamics that I think have wide ranging, economic consequences and geopolitical consequences.
Yeah, one of the things that I think about, which is not the most novel idea, but is it does feel like the development of artificial intelligence and its potential for replacing work is in some ways similar to the Industrial Revolution, right? I think if you think about that period of time, you had machines taking over jobs that were traditionally done by people. So there was job displacement, creation of new jobs for sure. There was also this question of like things that used to be handmade by a person were now being produced in a kind of more factory-like way, a more impersonal way, certainly. So, kind of tying together the conversation around art, the conversation around being able to tell what's human made versus not, the conversation around the long term job loss that could, happen, and the subsequent replacement of jobs with new things that could also happen. How do you guys think about? And I'll start with Sarah this time. How do you guys think about the relationship to this particular evolution of technology and the industrial revolution, or indeed other periods in history? Given that history is usually a good way to learn about current situations that actually have more in common with them than one might originally think.
Yeah, and I wonder if I mean, the greatest parallel I would make potentially would be to electricity. I mean, there's a whole set of, I mean, is that true dramatic? I mean, those things always sound very dramatic at the time, but I think the ability to, you have an innovation like electricity, and then all of a sudden refrigeration is different and homes are different. And like it leads to all these derivative impacts. I mean, the steam engine is the other historical parallel that a lot of, economists would talk about. So I would say this is equivalent to one of those major step functions, and it will not only change, some sector, but it will change finance. It will change. I mean, it will change all different kinds of markets and products. I mean, is it equivalent to the internet? I mean, these are all things that, economically, I think the impact will be, it's going to be in the trillions of dollars. It will be global. It will be cross industry. And I expect to last generations. So hard to be more techno optimist than that. But I would say it is in line with those historical paradigms.
And Mike, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm a technology optimist. You could use the Industrial Revolution, the mass productization of electricity, the automobile, ATM machines. You could think about the internet, and in every one of those cases, if you pinhole to somebody's specific job, that job did disappear. But if you look at post-industrial revolution, the average lifespan of a human being has nearly doubled. And there's no question that we live more comfortable lives than we used to. And a lot of that is because of our use of technology. And I think AI fundamentally is no different than that. In other words, it is very hard for us to predict how our life will look like for 10 years, other than to know that it's not like today. And so the obvious instinct we all have is my job is going away. It may not. The more repetitive and boring the job is, the more likely it is to go away. And the more intellectual and stimulating and creative and fun and different that it is less likely to go away. But that being said, the amazing thing about us humans is that we're extraordinarily adaptable. And so we always find a different way in which we can make ourselves useful and effective. I don't think it's going to be terribly different in AI. It doesn't mean that we're all going to become AI programmers, but we're going to find a lot of ways to create value and also enjoy and have more fulfilling lives. And in fact, what I think AI is going to do, especially in the short term meaning the next decade, is actually take away the most human, painful, annoying, and difficult jobs, whether it's working in a coal mine or lifting heavy objects or sorting mindlessly for hours on end during the day or sitting in traffic driving. These are all things that none of us really actually look forward to, but we have to do to earn a living. And I am of the opinion that as AI really fulfills its vision, that those jobs or those things that we do, we won't have to do anymore. And with that time, I'm a 100% sure that we're going to find other things to do that create more value and that make our lives better for others and for ourselves. Unlike some of the people in the world who think like, AI is the end of the world, their robots are going to take over, blah, 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 blah. First of all, let's remember that those robots are us. They learn from us. They learn from our Wikipedia entries and our history and everything else. ultimately, if it's us, it's not actually taking over. But even aside from that, I do think that it will actually be liberating to many of us rather than reducing our quality of life.
Got it. Got it. And a very nice segue. I have one last question here because we're running out of time. Mike, you said that it's hard to predict more than 10 years in the future, which makes this an even more fun question. And it sounds like your answer to this question will not be Terminator, given your optimism. But I would close by asking each of you, what's the thing, as bold a prediction as you want it to be, you know, how will our lives look different in 50 years as the result of changes in artificial intelligence? I'll start with Sarah.
I think it will have a dramatic impact on borders. If I'm able to actually communicate with people all over the world and transact, that somehow the world will feel more interconnected as a result of AI. I like even the question of like, could AI do diplomacy for us, which to me is actually the hardest problem given the nuance in negotiations between people. But I'll take, you know, because I think self-driving cars is more near term, but in 50 years, I think it will enable people around the world to be far more connected in a deep way, despite things that were historically differences.
And Mike?
Look, I think we'll be healthier. We'll live much longer lives. I think we'll be generally happier. I think that we will feel more fulfilled with the activities that we do in our lives. And I think that many of the things that we find torturous or painful or physically not fun, we won't be doing very much. That said, I think we're going to face a whole new set of problems that we didn't imagine before. Social networking, for example. We thought it would have some amazingly positive effects, which it probably has had, but it's also had some somewhat negative effects that we're figuring out how to deal with right now, as we did in this current election cycle. And I'm sure AI will pose some of those to us, but I'm confident that, you know, problems come up and we figure out how to tackle them. So, but on balance, I think the trajectory will be extraordinarily positive for people.
I think there will be a lot more quantification of emotion. So I think I'll be having relationships with AI, which I'm not today. Well, hopefully I'm around in 50 years. But I would say that's a major difference, is that, again, we talked about what the kind of inputs are, kind of text, natural language. I think we're going to get a lot more data about, again, related to the comment I made at the beginning about video. This makes Sarah happy. This makes Sarah sad. And there's all kinds of political kind of potential political ramifications of that. But I do think that we will have much more understanding of our own emotions that will enable us to program people to interact with us and have deeper emotional relationships than are possible today.
100%. Yeah, I think to close things out, I think the subtle change that's happened with the movement from traditional programming to machine learning, in my mind, is we used to live in a world where when you were programming a computer, you were writing instructions and telling the computer how to fundamentally view the world, right? But as we've moved towards models, the relationship we have has changed dramatically, where now the computer is telling you things about the world. And how we navigate that over time, I think, will be very interesting. And I tend to share the optimistic viewpoint that it will make our lives net better in the long term. But I do think it will be, we're not going to have the fasten seatbelt sign off the whole time. There will certainly be some turbulence in that process. But I look forward to seeing what transpires, and that's kind of what makes it all fun. So that's all we've got for today. So thank you everyone very much for joining us virtually, and look forward to talking to all of you soon.